Good mo- Hello, beloved. It's time for us to share together in sacred reading again. Sacred reading is based on the belief that we can hear the echoes of the divine, can hear spirit when we do sacred reading. We choose a sacred text, we read it aloud to ourselves, and we listen for how it might speak into our lives. It might be a word of encouragement, it might be a word of challenge. It might be just a new way of thinking, an invitation to remind us of who we are and what we're called to do in this world. And so, sacred reading, choose a good text, whatever the good text to you seems to be, and then you read it in short snippets. As I said, I encourage people to read the text aloud, mostly because I feel like it engages more of us. When we just use our eyes, sometimes we miss the nuance of sound. And, the biblical writers did, and most sacred writers, whether they write poetically or not, write in a kind of way that is anticipated to help us connect with the story itself. Not only the little s story, but the big S, the capital S story of all that is. So we have been working our way through the book of Ruth from the Hebrew Bible. Thus far in the story, Naomi and Elimelech and their two sons find themselves in Israel in a time of famine. And so they move to Moab. The two sons married to Moabite women. The husband, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, and her two sons die. The husbands of the two Moabite women that were married there, Orpah and Ruth. Orpah goes back to her people. Ruth will not leave Naomi and goes back to Israel with her. Now, it's important to know that part of the reason why that happens is because in the time that this would have been written, women didn't have access to ownership. They often relied on a brother, father, husband, cousin, uncle, a man at the time. That's just the reality of the time. And so Ruth and Naomi have come back to Bethlehem. And while there, Ruth has gone into the fields to glean, to try to get enough food to feed Naomi and herself. And that is where we find her. The owner of a field, whose name is Boaz, has seen Ruth, asked about Ruth, and is now getting ready to speak to Ruth. So listen with me if you will. I will just read it once aloud. When I do this, when I do sacred reading by myself, just to myself, I usually read the text 3 times aloud with pauses in between to kind of listen for a word or a phrase or an image that speaks to me. When we do this together, I just read it once, give a pause or break, at which time you can stop the recording and move on. Or you can stay and I'll share whatever rises for me in the text. It's not that whatever rises for me is the answer, it's what arose for me as I listened to the text. And maybe in hearing my example, that might give you a sense of how sacred reading might work for you. So today we're looking at Ruth chapter 2. We have verses 8 and 9. Listen with me for the winds of the Spirit. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen to my words, my child, and accept my offer. Don't collect your grain in anyone else's field but mine, and don't leave here. Stay within my borders, my binders. Watch them closely, and whatever part of the field they are harvesting, follow behind them. I have ordered all my reapers not to bother you. When you get thirsty, go to the water jars they bring with them and get a drink of water. Sometimes when you listen to a sacred text, it not only answers questions or gives you an image, but it brings up questions that lead you into a prayerful wondering, if you will. What might the text be saying to me? As I listen to this text, I hear Boaz making space for someone he does not even know. He knows about her because he's asked for a report, but he doesn't really know her. And in spite of that, he provides certain protections for her. The reapers would have been men, and the binders would have been women. And he instructs Ruth, invites Ruth to follow along behind the women, the binders, and collect any grain that's left over. He's instructed the reapers to leave her alone. And rather than having to bring her own water or go search for it elsewhere, he instructs her to share the water that will have been brought to the field for those who are working in the field. He offers that to her as a gift of hospitality. Now, we know often when we look at sacred texts, we see what hospitality looks like when we make room for the stranger, for this person we don't know. And the word that comes to my mind, the image, is of hospitality. Hospitality isn't always convenient. It isn't always easy, but it is certainly a call that the Bible places on our lives, that the sacred texts do, that we make space. And that in that making of space, we make space for the stranger, the other, and somehow, now I'm not looking particularly at this text, but what this brings to mind is how we're told biblically that that what we do to the least of these, our sisters and brothers, the way in which we welcome them is the way in which we welcome Christ, the way we welcome Jesus into our story. And there's a very close interrelationship between hospitality for one another and our hospitality and ability to entertain the divine in our lives. I'm struck by the fact that perhaps if I'm unwilling to entertain the stranger, the unknown, who I can see, how can I possibly entertain God, who I can't, except in the sign of the stranger and the signs of nature. So my invitation to me, that I think the text brought to me, is to make space, whether it's in a hospital waiting room or wherever we find ourselves, for the other, the stranger, who was another human being on this journey with us. And perhaps in so doing, we can find a way to bring them closer, and more importantly, to open ourselves to whatever God might be doing in our lives through the strangers that pass through. Hospitality, what a beautiful thing. As always, I like to remind you, you are infinitely precious and unconditionally loved for the gift you already are. Thanks for joining me this week. I'm in a different location, as you can tell. Perhaps next week I'll be back in my usual spot. But until then, I wish you all the best on your journey of sacred reading.